Okay, tonight we're going to cover this period of history from 50 to 100 A.D. in the church, and this is the development of the church, but we want to go back and talk about our friends, the Romans, again, just to understand the situation, just to gain sort of an understanding about what's going on in their life. Basically, three things that they were really, the culture in Rome was still pretty segmented. Many, just a few people had money, lots of slaves, lots of poor people living in cities. We think that poor cities are something of today. Really, poor cities were something that went on back then. The thing that they really liked was gladiators. Of course, we think about that, gladiators, like football. And they liked the chariot races, like NASCAR. And then they had some other thing they really liked, baths. Yeah, baths, okay? It's like kind of interesting. B-A-T-H-S, yeah, baths, baths, public baths. They like to take a bath every day. It was like kind of interesting. Sort of made them, here's the spread of the churches throughout the world at that time. But they really did have their situation in Rome. They really, this idea of going to the public baths and, just lounging around talking about politics and everything like that. It was sort of the Oprah of the day. They didn't have, cable TV. Oprah's a talk show for those on DVD in other countries. You don't really need to ever find out what she's about. She's not worth listening, and Dr. Phil is even less worth listening to. So, anyway, but it was an integral part of their daily life. It's like every afternoon they would go to this public area and, take a bath. It was part of their life. It was a ritual, and it made the Romans seem superior because they were clean. We're clean, you're not. So that's kind of I say that because it kind of dictates the way that the emperors and the others treated the society that they were trying to lead at this time, this one world that they were trying to keep together. In their minds, there was one world, Roman world, that's it. Really, all the way up into Britannia, Britain, what's now Britain, and all this is all that they really need to know, and the church is going throughout this. But as we go through, I just want to go through these emperors that are important during the period of our of the church development. The emperor that really, with the death of Christ, and at the death of Christ was Tiberius Caesar. Caesar was a title like President Obama. Tiberius Caesar, it came after. And he really he led Rome into sort of a dark age after Jesus Christ was crucified. The whole world was in an uproar. It was sort of like, I could say that I could guess that maybe the devil's engineering this. Of course he is. He's engineering this kind of mutiny and confusion throughout the Roman world so people really don't hear the message that Jesus Christ is about to proclaim to them, or the apostles are about to proclaim. Here's a better picture of how the church is. You can see all the little names there. How the church had spread very quickly from 33 till the death of Paul, all the way to Rome right now at this point. These are the churches that John founded. These, John will be someone we talk about later this evening because he's the last of the apostles and he lives to almost the year 100. So his kindness, his guiding force as the last of the apostles is important. So the first Roman emperor here, Tiberius, that's That's what he looked like, apparently. Sort of a strange nose there. Kind of like that nose. Kind of looks like mine. Anyway, he had the things that were happening is that the Roman world, to go back to the picture of the Roman world had become hard to manage. They were up in France, they were up near Germany, they were up in Britain, they were having trouble in Africa, and they were having trouble in Judea. And always a trouble spot, Judea, Persia also. And so keeping all of these people together was more difficult than they thought. Alexander the Great had brought the empire together, really, with all of his conquests, and the Romans had held it together for a good season. But now, Tiberius, this is Tiberius, he was finding it difficult. They had to use more and more of their money to pay for the army to try and keep their empire together, because in order to send somebody to some of the places up north, you had to pay them better. You had to pay them better. So when the money was running out, they were given lands and slaves and these kind of things. And so that, Rome was becoming, they were trying to buy off the army. Really, the emperor would serve at the will of the army. He had to have the army behind him. So he was really a bad judge of character, this guy, Tiberius. And, he decided that he was going to let, Caligula rule. That was one of his sons, and he turned out to be like just a crazy heathen. All heathens are crazy, but he was crazier than most. And he had the army behind him because he was sort of the favorite of Tiberius's wife, and that's why Caligula managed to get there. His mother was actually exiled, and his two older brothers were executed, and then when they all made up, they said, "We'll give you the throne." So Caligula was ruling. So Tiberius ruled to 37. Caligula ruled from 37 to 41. I know this is a little bit of review, but just to it was wondrous. He fell ill at a certain point early in his reign, and he became. People wondered whether he was mad or just bad. This is what he looked like. They wondered if he was just mad or bad. He was young. He was young in his 20s when he became the emperor. And he wanted to become a god. He really wanted to become a god. That was his great thing. And the army didn't like him because one time they sent them into battle, and then he just told them to go collect seashells. Kind of an interesting, So I just say this so you think like leaders can, leaders are amazing. We don't know how it would happen. It's just fortunately in our country, we don't take care of them the way bad leaders or leaders we don't like, we don't take care of them the way that they did in Rome. The behavior that was making Caligula so unpopular led to his murder. And they also killed the wife and the daughter. They were all there together, and they just, they killed him so that Claudius could become the emperor. That's the next person, Claudius. And this guy, he was pretty much a pretty decent emperor. Now, his time is during really the height of the Apostle Paul's missionary journeys, 41 to 54. The Apostle Paul's missionary journeys were during this period of time. He was, sort of, it doesn't show it here, but he was sort of disfigured apparently when he was young, and he was really he was clumsy. He was sort of a clumsy person. But the interesting thing is, once he became the emperor, he was very committed to his job. He would begin work at midnight every night. I don't know when he slept. He'd take his bath, apparently, and then go to bed, but then he'd wake up at midnight and manage the empire that came to him. During his reign, there was a serious revolt in Britain, led by a couple of women. Kind of interesting. But it was put that, and it happened during this, a couple of women led a revolt in Britain, and he managed to subdue that revolt and also really subdue the whole island at that point. So Britain became really an outpost of the Roman Empire, a really strong outpost of the Roman Empire, unlike maybe before. But he had he had trouble in selecting wives. He had one wife and she turned on him, so he had her killed. It's kind of interesting. You marry these people. And then he married another one. He married his own niece. So yeah, you know how that goes. Okay. He married his own niece. Her name was Agrippina, and she had a son. She had two sons: Britannius, who was named for the, Britannicus, who was named not for the encyclopedia, which didn't exist at that point. Nobody knows that. You don't even know what an encyclopedia is, do you? Okay. All right. Britannicus, who was named for the conquering of Britain. The mother had him killed so that Nero could be the emperor. So we come to that point. This is where Nero enters the picture, and it really begins. To this point, really the church's persecution is Jewish. Saul of Tarshish and the Jews are taken care of. And the Romans looked at Christianity primarily as a sect of Judaism. It's like it's just one of the Hebrews' religions. And there were, like, other groups that they had to deal with, and they just figured, well, Jesus isn't really interested in conquering this world because he's a king from another world. So, the Christian movement was finding a home in the hearts of all these slaves and all the poor in all the cities. It was really, a city religion. It was like people heard this, and it was, what do I have to give? The kind of idea of salvation by grace was really popular to people who were used to paying money for little trinkets or sacrifices. What do you mean? What do I have to give? Just my heart? Are you serious? Do I have to cut it out? No, you just ask, you believe and receive the salvation of God and you're baptized. That's it. And it became very, very popular. It was started to go. We see those. You saw how all those churches started so quickly. And so the Jewish authorities would handle pretty much the Christian issue. That the Romans thought the Jewish authorities would handle the Christian issue through their own means, through their own laws. But the Jews had given up something, okay? The Jews had, coming underneath the authority of Rome at a certain point, near the end of, from like 100 B.C. up until the birth of Christ. During that period of time, the family of priests that had gained control of the temple and the government of Jerusalem, they gave up something. They gave up the right to capital punishment, which was something God had given Noah to rule the society, and which was really, if you read through the book of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, you see that there are a lot of things that are punishable by stoning and death, including rebellious children. It's a great one. We didn't have that. Some of you might not be here if they had that still. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, bad. Okay, but that was really part of the whole. And so the Romans, so that was the thing. The Jews saw how effective it was for Romans to kill their enemies. And the Jews wanted that power. And so they turned Jesus Christ over. Really, Barabbas was captured leading a rebellion, and the Jews were going to let him get killed. Because anyone who was making trouble for this, we see that in the Gospel of John, anyone who was making trouble for the nation or the places of the chief priests or those in the Sanhedrin, anyone making trouble, the Jews really wanted to get rid of the way the Romans got rid of their enemies. And so this blurring of the line, the Jewish religious leaders who had also now become governmental authority, they began to cooperate with the Romans. They began to affiliate with them And they began to make these deals with the world. And this was going to, we'll see this later, this is going to really have tragic, unbelievable consequences for them. So Nero came to power about 54, and he ruled for 14 years to 68. And he started out pretty well. It began violently as, it began sort of violently when Claudius was poisoned. Agrippina wanted Nero to be Caesar sooner than anyone, and Claudius wasn't dying quick enough for her, so she poisoned him with mushrooms. And and the doctor that was there that was supposed to help Claudius was actually in on the deal and put a poison feather down his throat just to seal the deal. So the poison feather to try and make him vomit up the poison. Actually, he got more poison in him, so he died. And then Nero he was a young man, and he enjoyed theater, music, horse racing. That was his thing. And the one thing was Agrippina, the mother behind everything. We'll spell that for you. She had a desire to be, the queen, and she wanted to control her son, but her son would not be controlled. And he did some things. There were some secret trials that had come to, that had become part of the picture under Claudius's rule to get rid of people who were plotting against the emperor. And he would just kill really just convict and crucify those who had been against him. And then Nero became there. And, at a certain point, he was tired of his mother. He decided to kill his mother, and threw her off a ship, but she swam to shore. And then, and then he sent soldiers. He sent soldiers, to kill her to complete the job, and that turned the whole empire against him, which was sort of, But during this period of time, this isn't Nero. This is Nero here. During this period of time, Christianity is spreading, and Paul actually appeared before Nero. And, the troubles that were going on in the empire needed to have some sort of explanation. And this is what Nero wanted to be worshipped as a god. These are senators bowing down to him right there. That's kind of interesting how that went. But here we see what he decided to burn Rome. This was just like one of these things he decided. Things were getting so out of control, he was afraid for his life, so he decided to burn the city down. So he burnt the city down, and with his, he had assigned soldiers to do this. And, he needed someone to blame, so he blamed the Christians. This began like the first great persecution in the Roman Empire. The first great persecution in the Roman Empire was the persecution under Nero. He began to, he killed Peter, he killed Paul, and he began to do, the Christians they would not worship the Caesar. They would not worship Caesar as a god. And so this made them instantly enemies of the state. And so it was easy to convict them and easy for them to be caught because they really were poor people, mostly slaves. Although in some of Caesar's household there was Christian influence going on because of Paul's ministry during his years in house arrest in Rome. So this was this burning of Rome that he did. He blamed on the Christians, and then that began, the persecutions that we see like this. And these are, really we see all kinds of things. This was one of Nero's favorite things, was to put people on poles, cover them with tar, and set them on fire. And we see, look at the people here. This was part of the gladiator games. These people were hungry, poor, and they would come in here and just scream for blood. And this was part of what they do. Killing the Christians became part of the entertainment under Nero. They would put them in the stadium there, in the Colosseum, and the lion would come up, and of course was a hungry lion. And they would just really, the things that happened at this time was they would sing, they would preach, and they would sing. The stories are like the people would sing, the girls would sing, and the men would preach until their last breath. And it had a major effect on army people and gladiators. Like, it became a great scandal because great gladiators became believers. And and when they became believers, they believed in the "thou shalt not kill a man." And the gladiators were supposed to fight to the death, and the people would cheer for the gladiator to strike down somebody, and they wouldn't do it because they were believers. So these became, you can imagine this. This looks like sort of like, an American football stadium. They're screaming, 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 kill, 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 and they're preaching to these thousands of people. Lots of massive evangelistic campaign that way, Really, and it was, just like Stephen was stoned, preaching the gospel, and these people would die preaching the gospel. So eventually Nero fled to the countryside and killed himself as the generals decided, after burning, it was only, I think, 10 of 14 districts were completely destroyed in Rome. So however that figures out, 10 of 14 districts were completely destroyed. I don't know how that figures out with the Great Chicago Fire. The Great Chicago Fire, I think, flattened, about half the city of Chicago. We had Baltimore Fire here that flattened about 50 blocks in 1900, the Great Baltimore Fire. The only thing that survived, I think, was the Baltimore Sun's iron building. Kind of interesting. It's like sort of, they had an iron building there, and it survived the fire. But just interesting that survived. But that was after this, a different class of emperor was going to come into the picture for Rome. The soldiers had had enough, and there were so many soldiers now that really, if they all voted for the same person, there was no, if they had an election, they all vote for the same person. That's how big the army was at this point. The army made up a large part of the empire at this time. So after Nero, within a year there was 4 different generals sort of juggling for position. This man's name is Galba. He's one of the 4. He was only there for about a month or 2. There was 4. They just kept stabbing each other, killing each other, just wiping each other out, trying to get something, trying to get control of the throne, heredity, and the kind of passing down of rule was like to your favorite kid or your favorite nephew. That was the way it was going to go here. And so the Jewish kind of situation just kept going on. They kept persecuting Christians, and but the church kept spreading. The church kept spreading as all these little difficulties were happening in Rome. The church kept growing. The confusion that was happening in the empire was fueling this faith in people. It was fueling this faith in people. There is something that the Christians have that is permanent and real. And if their king is going to come and establish his rule at some point, then we might as well be his subjects now. And that was fine as long as it was quiet. But now the army, began to select. So there was Nero died, and then 3 other guys died very quickly in the next couple of months before Vespasian was the next one. And now this man is important because of his 2 sons also. Vespasian had 2 sons. Titus is important because he will lead the Roman legions into the Holy Land, into the Promised Land. And this will end Jerusalem as the center of worship for the Jews. I mean, it is right now really in their hearts, but as a physical, real thing, it will end with Titus. Titus eventually will be emperor at a certain point. After him, Titus will follow Vespasian. Titus and Domitian. These are the two sons of Vespasian. They are all soldiers. They are all soldiers. He came out of Africa. Vespasian came out of Africa. And he put down a Jewish rebellion, an early Jewish rebellion that we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. He put down the first one, and that won him favor. That won him favor. That part of the world was quiet now. This is the first general kind of, this was Galba, and then after him comes Vespasian. And these leaders, they just dealt with things with soldiers. They dealt with things with soldiers. That's the way they dealt with it. Just soldiers, and everything was a battleground. Let's see. They started to, what's happening in Rome at this time? Okay, they're starting to rebuild the city. They're starting to get, things. There's this Vespasian lives, so this 68 is just like total chaos. 4 different rulers. From Vespasian rules for 10 years, 69 to 79. He said, "No one follows me but my sons." And so this man will come after him to 80, 81, and then after that, 81 to 95, I believe it is. Is it 95? 96. 81 to 96, and this will get us to the year 100, which is when the Apostle Paul will go home. So these first two men, Vespasian and Titus, they were very orderly. They kept order in the Roman Empire. The peace and the prosperity of the empire was moving ahead, and it had become a settled place. It had become a really settled place for people. So the comfort zone had become there, and so they started turning themselves toward toward the persecutions of people who were not a part of the whole party. So the Christians became, and the Christians were good for the gladiators. They were good to bring in there. They entertained the people. Killing Christians was a great business to keep the empire, to keep people in the empire under control. But Vespasian, especially, he had humble beginnings. He was not like of a landowning family. He started in the army, worked his way up to be a general, and then that made him very popular with the people. He was one of them, and the fact that he was he wore a sword and armor, that was even better for them. And it was again, he reintroduced this idea of the emperor as God. Though later in his life, as he was dying, he says, "I think I'm becoming a god." That was one of the last things he said. So again, this had like sort of, the people had sort of gotten away from this idea of the emperor as God, and then right back into it, the emperor is declaring himself to be a god. So let's just go over. So Titus's 2 years were probably some of the best years in all of Rome, really. Some of the best years in all of Rome. The Colosseum that we've shown you. You know what the Colosseum looks like, right? Do I have to show you again? No. Okay, Colosseum. There was a tunnel that was built, one of the world's first man-made tunnels. It was made by slaves, Jewish slaves who were brought from Judea. Judea was under control because Jerusalem was gone. Jerusalem was gone. They had flattened it and built a temple to Jupiter there. And Jews were not allowed to live there anymore. And that was how the Romans were going to deal with that situation. And Titus had done that. And because he had done that, they brought him, after Vespasian died, they put him on the throne. "You are the one who solved all of our problems. You are the one who solved all of our problems." This is important for us to understand, because this will be precisely the kind of approach that the final world leader will bring when he appears on the stage after the tribulation, in the midst of the tribulation. That will be one of his things. It is the Jews. It is the Jews. It is Israel. As long as Israel is allowed to exist, there is a problem. So in the middle of the Great Tribulation, if you study the Bible, in the middle of the Great Tribulation, there's peace, there's peace, there's peace, 3.5 years of peace. It's a 7-year tribulation. The second part of that is the worst part of human life. That's what Daniel calls it. It's going to be days of unbelievable suffering. And the thing that the Antichrist will bring is that this nation has always been the trouble. So let's just do what the Romans did. Let's flatten it. And so it's funny how, not funny, but diabolical, really. It's diabolical, it's satanic, this kind of idea that the people of God are always the problem, whether they're Christians or whether they're Israel. In the Great Tribulation, of course, there won't be Christians to blame and burn because we'll all be gone. But of course there will be some who will be coming to know who Jesus Christ is, and they will have to hang on. And they will also be martyred at that time. But that's why it's important for us to understand this idea that nothing new under the sun, the pyramids, the cows that we saw all around the world, this idea that Israel is the problem and needs to be put under our thumb is like a recurring idea. We see it in the news all the time. The world leaders, they call Zion the problem. Zion is the problem. If we wipe Zion off the map, then we'll all be peaceful. Not true. Not true. If you read the Quran, Islam is supposed to take over the whole world because of the chaotic conditions that come. Okay. You all right? You okay? All right. It's interesting? I hope. All right, okay. Okay. So we're going to go into that in just a second. We'll just talk about these last couple of emperors. This ended one sort of dynasty, the dynasty that, the dynasty that came with Vespasian. They were called Flavian. The family of the Flavian family, I guess, or the Flavian, whatever, wherever that comes from. This was this dynasty that lasted through Domitian, and then he was murdered. The Titus was a good ruler, two great years, but somehow he died. It's still a mystery. He completed the work on the Colosseum. He completed a couple of other building projects, a great arch to honor himself, all of it done with Jewish slave labor. They brought Jewish slaves to build all these things. It's like the Jews said something, or the people said something important when Jesus was before Pilate. They said, "We have no king but Caesar." And so God had turned them over to Caesar. And that's what was happening here. God had turned them over to Caesar, and the Caesars were abusing them. Okay, so after, let's take a new page here. Okay, we'll try a new page. After, just to complete through this, after there was Nerva and Trajan, these men came after. Can you read that? It's not really good, is it? We'll just erase it. That's good. Isn't that technology wonderful? Wow, look at that. Okay. What's that? Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. All right. I'm trying to type it out. Maybe I'll just type it out and it'll just, bang, it'll just appear. Would that help you? Yeah, I guess it would. Okay. All right. So like I said, the Roman Empire had become like a far-flung empire, and in the north, the Germanic tribes who were warriors and worshipped gods who were warrior gods, they were marching. They were marching, and they were trying to break free from the Roman Empire, and they had been captured and put under authority by force, and then now when they were stronger, bigger, stronger army, they were making trouble in the north. The best thing that what these men tried to do was buy the army. They tried to buy the army. Nerva ruled 96 to 98 A.D. after Domitian. Domitian did something. He raised the pay. He gave a large pay raise in 84 A.D. to secure his position. But it wasn't enough. 12 years later, he was still murdered by the army. They didn't like him, and his own wife was part of the picture. But and then Nerva became the emperor, and he had been a counselor. He was not so much an army person, but he was more of a counselor, and he immediately made promises to to raise the pay of the army again, but he couldn't deliver on it, so he was killed. So that's that. And then Trajan became the emperor, and he ruled for almost 30 years to 117 A.D. And he was very successful. He conquered the area of what's now Hungary, and also moved over into Romania, expanding the empire eastward. And they could find, what they found in Romania was gold and salt, which made people rich and their food tasty. So money and food were great for the people, and so he was that's why he served for so long. People were really happy about it. He treated the Senate with respect, and he managed to name good officials. For him, this also was after Domitian. There was a great period of persecution for the church. Now, this was primarily a time of peace for the church. He found the Christians to be, not worth persecuting in his mind. He treated them like other citizens, and he punished them only when they deserved it. And he was very generous to Rome's population. Rome became an amazingly beautiful city during his time, and it became a melting pot. It became full of all kinds of different people there. And so he held on to power. It was a civilized rule, and it set the tone really for the next, if these, let's see, let's go back, let's think about it. Go back. We think about, you think about Claudius, and this time of the spread of the church. This is the spread of the church here. This is a significant period. These 13 years, and then also, then you come to these 29 years. These 50-some years, the church movement, the mission movement that was going on during this time, because of the peace and the stability of the empire, and because of the will of the emperor not to bring a great deal of persecution upon the church, really established, it helped establish, God was in control of this situation. God was in control of this situation. When Peter and Paul were leading the church, but it was time for them to go, there was Nero there in charge, and he murdered them. And that had its own effect on scattering Christians who maybe, and for some of them, later in the 200s, we'll talk about the underground Christians, the catacombs. There will come another time of great persecution later, about 180 A.D. There will be a time of the worst kind of persecution that's going on. So that's the Roman world at that time. And then we also have to deal with the Jewish world. The Jews living in Judea and what's happening. They had lived in Rome, all throughout Rome, since the 2nd century B.C. And Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar really had supported laws that made their religion acceptable. And so, even though it wasn't a pagan religion, it was not an offensive religion to the emperor for the most part, and they allowed it. They allowed it to go, and we know that Herod built a great temple. But Judea was ruled. Judea was always trouble for the Romans, because there was always an element of Jewish society that didn't want to be the foreign rule. They were looking for their own. They were looking to become their own country again. And the problems really began. We see it in Jesus' day. This Canaanites, this is a name for a political party. This is what Simon the Zealot was. He was one of this party, led by a man named Judas, and probably Barabbas was one of this number too. These were your radical element of, radical is, what do we want to say it? Radical Jews. That's probably the best way to say it. They were not going to, they did things. They were terrorists, really. Terrorists. Primarily their targets, they targeted the army. And that was not a good thing. When the emperor is a soldier and you're targeting the men that are keeping him in power, that's not a good thing for your survival. So they targeted the army, small little things, kill 10 soldiers there, 20 soldiers there, and then but the answer that would come back would be massive. Like, what do they call it? Shock and awe. That's what they used to say, shock and awe. When the United States went into Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait, when Iraq invaded Kuwait a few years ago, I think it was 1989, 1990, America went to rescue the country, Kuwait, from Iraq and said, we're going to shock them and awe them with massive firepower. And that was really Rome's way, was if there was trouble, we're going to come and we're going to come down hard on you. Still, the center of Jewish life was the temple. This temple. The second, there was Solomon's temple. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And then there was the next temple. The next temple, Zerubbabel's temple, was built. And then that temple was expanded by Herod. And so the temple was still the center of Jewish life. Center. And it's also, because this is where the apostles are from, and James, the brother of Jesus, it's still one of the, there's still a strong Christian element in and around the temple. Things are still happening in the temple. And this is primarily led by James, Jesus' brother. James the Just, he came to be known. Or they used to have another name for him, Camel Knees. Yeah, Camel Knees, because he prayed so much, really. That became like one of his names. He prayed so much, they called him Camel Knees. That was James. He was the brother of Jesus, son of Mary and Joseph. Did not believe in Jesus when Jesus, was ministering and preaching and everything like that. His brothers and sisters did not believe in Jesus. But then, after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to James. And James, believed and became a leader in the church. The leader, really, in the Jerusalem. There was a significant council there, Jerusalem Council. And Jerusalem Council, there is some some people who claim really there was no sort of hierarchy or government that was over that early part of the church age, but really there was, and they had discussions as a council. But really, the man who managed the council was James, the brother of Jesus. He was the leader. He directed the debate in these councils. I'm saying this because his death, his martyrdom by the Jews, started something. It's like James is a witness. Saul's persecution of the church had scattered Christians outside of Jerusalem. They had gone from Jerusalem to Judea, to Samaria. They were starting to move Saul's war against them, and then he became a believer, and a leader. And he became Paul, and he started to preach in all the places where Christians had been driven and expanding the gospel all over. And so we know that Antioch, we talked about this last week, Antioch had become really this Christian center just because of, the persecution that constantly continued. But James remained. James really remained in Jerusalem and a leader in Jerusalem. The Jerusalem believers had James as their pastor. I guess that's for lack of a better word. He was their pastor, and he was still in there preaching and leading the church, even though the persecutions kept coming. They kept coming from their own people because the Jewish believers were being persecuted by the temple leaders. Let's see. Okay, so this rebellion that would come to this area, in the first part, the first thing that would happen, there would be sort of like a small thing around 60, a small sort of a 60 to 63, a small sort of rebellion in Galilee. And maybe you know this. This was led by a man. Maybe you've seen his book mentioned, Josephus. Josephus. He wrote. He lived from I think 37 to 100, and he was a Jew who was really leading a group of rebels. And these rebels were pinned down, and they decided to, rather than commit suicide, they decided to kill each other. And they did that until there was just two. And then Josephus and his buddy decided, why should we kill each other? Why don't we just throw ourselves on the mercy of Rome? And so he did. And Josephus became an advisor on Judean affairs. And we have writings from him. He mentions Christ in his writings on the history of Judea and the Jewish wars. He wrote a history for that. So he became, what would you call that, a compromiser? Traitor? I don't know. You can call him whatever you want. Maybe that's why the rabbis don't really accept some of Josephus's work. But, everyone killed themselves except Josephus and his bodyguard or his buddy. And Josephus lived a long, happy life with 3 different wives. So that's, and he wrote, and he had a lot of time on his hand, apparently. He got out of the trouble spot, went to Rome, and became just a very, just a writer, basically. Not just a writer. Writing's hard. But he started writing the histories of the Jewish wars. And so, so this first uprising, Vespasian put down, and this led to the army loving him. Vespasian put this down, and then he was, so he was made emperor, and then Titus took over after him, fighting the wars that were going on in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem. So this chaos, this chaos sort of continued. Chaos in and around Jerusalem. And, the very thing that the chief priests had tried to avoid, had come back on them. There was a massacre. There was a massacre in a small city. The city's called Jotapata. With this little battle, after Josephus surrendered himself, the Romans went in and killed 40,000. Killed 40,000, Jews in Judea, and that was the beginning of trouble for this part of the world. For this part, they killed 40,000, and Josephus, managed to escape all of this. Let's see. All right. Let's see. Okay. Do we want to get into that? Okay. Let's say one more thing before we take our first break. There's a timeline that happens. Okay, so 60 to 63 we have, 60 to 63 we have this Galilean conflict going on. And then in 62, this happens. 62, this happens. The people who were running the temple had made a confederation with the Roman occupiers, and they saw James as a threat. They really did. But everyone knew James, camel knees, was a righteous person. He was called the righteous one. He was considered a holy man by everyone in Jerusalem. And only the hardcore people connected with the temple were against James. And they decided one day that, because of all the trouble these things were sowing, they thought, if we put James on the pinnacle of the temple, if we let him speak to the people, maybe he will calm the people down, and maybe he will talk about it. Maybe he won't talk about Jesus. The problem is when James got up on the pinnacle of the temple, he began to preach about Jesus, the Son of Man. He started to preach, a message, a gospel message on Jesus Christ. And they decided this wasn't so they threw him down from the temple. They threw him down from the pinnacle of the temple. It's just a problem. He survived. He survived the fall. And he was still preaching and praying for people. And someone tried to save him. They said, look, the righteous one is praying for you. But the laundry, and it wasn't dry cleaning back then, but they used to beat, they'd wash things and then they'd beat the water out of it. A fuller's club is what it was called. James was cast off the pinnacle of the tabernacle. It wasn't really high. I'm not saying, so he survived the fall. It was like a 2-story fall, which really is something, but he survived it. But, a fuller, a launderer, a dry cleaner, a cleaner, hit him with his club and, spilled his brains, and that was the end of James at that time. Again, why is this significant? James dies. Why is this significant? Because the witness, the testimony is gone. Testimony gone, and by 70, for Jerusalem, it will be over. Okay, so you can go and get a cup of tea and think about that. I'm sorry, James spilled his brains out. Maybe you don't want to go buy a sandwich now after that. But James dies in 62, and that's the beginning of the final war on Judea for the Romans. So, okay, let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about the siege of Jerusalem and all of the gory details. Okay? Not really gory, I'm just saying. Okay. All right.